Hello, everyone, and welcome to the College and Career Readiness and Success Center's webinar, Maximizing Post-Secondary Outcomes for Students with Disabilities Through Systems Alignment. Today's webinar is the third in a series of webinars focused on supporting students with disabilities in their college and career readiness efforts. We'll be hosting our fourth and final webinar in this series in the fall of 2018. And we've included a link in the chat box if you'd like to register for this webinar. Before we get started, we wanted to share just a little bit about the CCRS Center. We are a federally funded technical assistance center charged with supporting state and local education agencies in their college and career readiness efforts, including supporting the implementation of policies and initiatives focused on ability skills, post-secondary preparedness, and the education to workforce pipeline. And we do this work by supporting a range of technical support to our stakeholders. Throughout the webinar, there will be several opportunities to engage with the moderator and presenters. If you have any questions during the webinar, you can use the chat box function located on the right-hand side of the screen. You can also select the raise hand function to speak on the line. Finally, we will be collecting feedback after the webinar where you can provide additional feedback on your experience. And we'll also be posting a recording of the webinar and the PowerPoint slides online after the event on the CCRS Center events page. Now I'd like to turn it over to my colleague Jamar Nellums, who will moderate this webinar and kick us off with our first polling.
Hi, it's my pleasure today to be facilitating the workshop, the webinar. And we'd actually like to get started with a poll, and then I'll roll through the agenda and who our presenters will be today. So we're asking you to please answer the following question. To what extent does your agency or organization formalize cross-sector partnerships to support career readiness for students with disabilities? And so we'll take a few moments, a minute or so, to allow folks to weigh in. And again, one more time, to what extent does your agency formalize cross-sector partnerships to support career readiness for students with disabilities? Great, and if we can close that poll. Excellent, so this is helpful. So 36% of you responded to a great extent, 36% somewhat, and then 9% very little, not at all, and I don't know. So hopefully today's webinar will provide you with some information on practices that help facilitate the alignment of systems and cross-agency, cross-stakeholder partnerships to support students with disabilities. And so today's agenda, we've already done the welcome and the introduction and then our first poll. And then we are going to turn it over to our AIR experts to give some background context and a few promising practices that relate to aligning systems and cross-stakeholder partnerships. They'll talk about the value, and they'll talk about the challenges and promising practices from work that we know is currently going on in the field across the country. And then we are very fortunate today to have representatives from the state of Maine who will be giving us their perspective. We have a representative from the Vocational Rehabilitation Agency and the Department of Education, and they'll speak about how they've worked together to support the career readiness for students with disabilities. And then we'll provide you some resources as we wrap up. And again, as mentioned a little earlier, we will be providing a PowerPoint of today's presentation after the presentation itself. So just a little bit of information about our presenters today. We have Libby Stone Sterling, who is the Director of Division of Vocational Rehabilitation from the Maine Department of Labor. And as a Director of Division of Vocational Rehabilitation, Libby is responsible for the management and oversight of Maine's Vocational Rehabilitation Program. We also refer to that as VR. And in that capacity, she's directed agency services for transition-age youth and young adults with disabilities and has worked very closely with the Department of Education. We also have joining us today from Maine, Dr. Roberta Lucas, who is the Federal Programs Coordinator from the Maine Department of Education and a part of the Special Services team. In her role, she oversees integrated monitoring activity and also the Federal Indicator 13 related to post-secondary transition planning. And then joining us from AIR, we have Dr. Tessie Rose Bailey, who is a Principal Technical Assistance Consultant. And in her role, she primarily provides responsibilities related to technical assistance in special education and multi-tiered systems of support for states, districts, and institutions of higher education through a number of national centers. And we also have with us today Dahlia Shaywitz, who is our managing researcher and our practice area director of disability and rehabilitation. Dahlia leads and manages teams of researchers and practitioners on projects related to education, including literacy and knowledge translation, and knowledge translation, including translating research into practical information. So very glad that we have everyone joining us today. And I'm going to turn this over to Dr. Tessie Bailey to start us off.
Thanks, Jamar. And thank you for allowing me to come and talk about the value of aligning systems and cross-stakeholder partnerships to support students with disabilities or youth with disabilities. I'm going to talk primarily about the what and why of why we should be collaborating in systems alignment. And then my colleagues are going to provide a lot of examples about the how. A lot of people say, so what really is the value of this collaboration and systems alignment? When we think about how we support youth with disabilities, we really have to take a comprehensive approach. There's no single entity or division within a state that has all the resources, funds, staff, or capacity to really do all the work that needs to be done. And in fact, there's multiple pieces of legislation that exist that really need to be aligned to give students the full opportunity to be successful. Every state sort of approaches how they support implementation of these acts, and it's looking at the divisions within the State Department or even at the local level and identifying who are the partners that are the most successful. When we think about what the research says, what I'll say right off the bat is there's not a ton of research in this area. And I think part of it is because people have the belief that if we work together, we're more likely to have better outcomes, whether it's education or any other type outcome. We do have some work or research that's indicating that when we have interagency collaboration, that we can improve students' opportunities for post-school employment as well as education. And in fact, those students who participate in programs in which they're supported by interagency collaboration are more likely to have better outcomes than those who don't. There is a single study that looks at this idea of partnerships, which my colleague Dahlia Shaywitz will talk a lot about. And it's how do we more formalize the way that we work together? And in that work, we have found that students who participate similar to interagency collaboration, and this is just a very specific way, we can really improve the transition that students have from a school-based type setting to a post-school setting. Part of that work also has to do with students, or part of that research and the outcomes has to do with students' access to community services. So when we have really strong partnerships and strong interagency collaboration, what we find is that those students also have greater access to community service providers. And that's helping a student move from this very safe, focused area on education, public education, to a community-based setting. And the partnerships allow the entities to really align the support so that what's happening in the K-12 setting is really providing the opportunities, the instruction, and the skills necessary for students or youth with disabilities to benefit from the community-based services that will be available under other acts. So when we think about interagency collaboration, you'll hear a lot about that today, it's really this idea of a clear, purposeful, carefully designed process that promotes this cross-agency, cross-program, cross-disciplinary collaborative efforts. And I've talked a lot about the overall benefits to youth with disabilities, but there are also a number of other benefits that come down to infrastructure and implementation. We know that if we engage in this really purposeful partnerships or collaboration, we see a better coordination of our services and supports. And as a result, we see a reduced cost in our efforts to provide services because we're leveraging the resources across multiple entities. We also find that when we collaborate, we're more collective. We have a better effort to collectively identify the gaps that exist in our comprehensive system and then work together to fill those gaps. We've also seen an increase in the efficiency in which we deliver transition services. And we know that timing is really important. Students who are moving from a school-based to a community-based setting can't really wait for the delay once they've moved back into the community. And using an interagency collaborative approach, we're seeing a more efficiency in the transition from the school-based setting to the post-school setting. And then finally, when we think about who are the potential collaborators, it really depends on what level that you're engaging in this effort. So if you're at the state level, you might be engaging with collaborative efforts with your voc rehab, which we'll hear about today, but you could have your post-secondary Office of Disabilities, you could have different departments within your State Department of Education, but you may also be engaging in conversations with employers who are really critical to the state work. At the same time, you may have different stakeholders or partners that you may be engaging with at the local level. So local employers, local families and students, local internal district divisions that are going to improve the outcomes that you have for students with disabilities, as well as the efficiency and effectiveness of the system that you have in place. I want to pass this over to my colleague, Dahlia Shaywitz, who's going to really talk about some of the challenges and some of the practices that we have been implemented to overcome some of those challenges.
Great, thank you, Tessie. Hi, everyone, and I also thank you for this opportunity to share some information about a few projects. I'm working on several projects here at AIR that are related to transition age youth. And in the vocational rehabilitation or VR system, that encompasses 14 to 24-year-olds. So I know that's a larger population than some of the special education students that you're serving. I'm going to share some examples from these projects as I discuss some common challenges and promising ways to address those challenges to support cross-system partnership. So challenges. Some of the most common challenges have to do with trust, mutual beneficial results, and data sharing. In terms of trust, if there is no existing relationship between your agency and another agency, or if there's been some previous negative experiences, it can take time to build those relationships. Those relationships, I want to add, are important not just at the state level, but also at the district and even the school level. So it's important to spend time developing relationships, building trust, and that means also communicating regularly. Mutual benefits, I could have renamed that WIIFM, WIFM, what's in it for me, and I think that's fair. I think it's fair if an agency like yours is going to provide resources, people, time, money towards some sort of approach, then you want to know that there's some benefit to you and the constituents that you're serving. So there should be a value add for both parties or all parties involved. This also helps make sure that everyone really has buy-in to whatever plans are made at the state level, so that staff within the system understand the value of that program or the value of that approach. or the value of a research study in the case of some of the work we're doing at AIR. And then data sharing. So that can be a really significant challenge, even when the agencies are housed, offices are housed within the same agency. There are privacy issues, of course, for student-level data in K-12 systems that may be different than privacy issues for VR clients or Department of Labor, other clients. Libby Stone-Sterling from Maine, and we'll be talking a bit about data sharing, and not only with K-12, but also within her Department of Labor, or at least could address some questions around that. Next slide. Strategies for success. What we found is some things that have really worked well for state-level partnerships have included issues around funding, communication, and liaisons. In terms of funding, oftentimes the agency that has the funding drives the agenda. So for several of the projects that I work on that I'll describe in a moment, the VR agency was able to drive the agenda and the planning because they operated the grant. And I'll talk a little bit about more about that on the next slide. In terms of communication, in Virginia and Kentucky, 2 states that we're working with, we're evaluating their career pathways projects. And one of the first things the state agency directors did was to identify all potential partners, and that includes employers, and they held meetings, and they continue to hold meetings annually. They also communicate regularly with stakeholders about the project, so everyone's staying engaged through newsletters, through websites, presentations. And they also share information about the work. So if you're, for example, with our research and evaluation data, as data becomes available, they're sharing that information with partners so that partners understand what's going on. It gives them a chance also to see where there are successes or things that are working well, and to see how their participation and input is valued. Part of communication also includes creating a shared language. Building relationships includes not just a shared terminology, but also a shared vision and a shared understanding of goals. But not everyone speaks the same language. And of course, not everyone understands the issues the same way around disability. Communication can help support that building of mutual language, mutual understanding, and in particular, when you're helping your youth or students with disabilities to transition into a career path, you can help employers understand the capabilities of a person with a disability. And then engage people with disabilities. That's common and usually expected in the work that we do here. Youth and students with disabilities and their family members can have a voice in the work you're doing. In my examples, these are research or evaluation projects, and the stakeholder voice is part of the evaluation design and data collection. Young people with disabilities know what they want and need a chance to explore their ideas and opportunities. For example, I was at an event in March, and there was a young person with a disability on a panel that I facilitated, and I asked him what advice he had about what had helped him succeed so far in terms of planning his career. And he said, you know, I'd like people to let me make my own decisions. I know what I want. But he also said, keep pushing me and encouraging me along the way. So that's the kind of input that's really valuable to have from the folks that you're providing services to. And the third thing, identify a liaison. That liaison can serve as the role of bridging systems. That's someone who's dedicated to talking across different agencies and employers. For example, vocational rehab nationally has put in place an effort to hire business consultants within their state agencies who work with employers. That's their primary role. In Maine, they're called business account managers. I think I got that right. And they liaise with employers to help the VR counselors and their clients. Virginia and Kentucky both have designated career pathway coordinators, and they are improving agency collaboration at the regional and the local level. Oops. Yes, success stories. So we are still in process in our research projects in Maine, Virginia, and Kentucky. The research is ongoing, but we have seen some promising work in a few states that I'd like to share with you around cross-agency collaboration. And the first example in Maine, and you can see the titles of the actual research or evaluation projects on the screen. Maine's Division of Voc Rehab has assigned vocational rehabilitation counselors to schools. And in some of the schools are quite active, working with the school staff to identify students for potential connection to VR before they graduate. A lot of students and their parents are concerned about what happens after they leave the K-12 system and those supports that they have in school disappear, and this really nice handoff to VR can be accomplished, and I know they're going to talk about that in a few minutes, so I won't go any further in detail about that. But in Virginia and Kentucky, where we're evaluating their career pathways programs, they've put disability at the center of their partnerships, and they are driving the design of career pathways to serve youth with disabilities. They've created camps, job shadowing, and a whole bunch of other work-based learning activities that get youth, including students with disabilities, aware of the types of jobs that are out there and in fields that they might not have thought of before, like IT or manufacturing. They're also working directly with employers to help them understand how to engage youth with disabilities. A lot of employers might not have imagined that a young person with a visual impairment or a young person who's blind could work on the manufacturing floor until they're there on the manufacturing floor and they're successful. So they're really helping to change the way people perceive youth with disabilities, and it's opening doors to jobs, and we're seeing a lot of success there. It also helps with your students with disabilities don't often have the same sort of after-school work experiences as students without disabilities, and so this way they start to build up a resume. So when they graduate, they're not starting from scratch. They have something to put on a resume to start their job search if they're not transitioning to college or some sort of post-secondary training. So those are some examples of the work we're doing. I leave it open to questions, and I'll turn it over to Jamar.
We have one question. We actually have two questions. So the first one that I'll start with, which may also be something for Maine to think about responding to as well, is how are these states, how are these successful states, Sedalia, the states that you just mentioned, dealing with liability and workers' compensation issues?
They are dealing with that. Let me try to remember. I know in Virginia we were talking about that, and Kentucky also, and Maine. This comes up everywhere, and I do think Maine could talk about it from their perspective. There are agreements in place before the youth go to a manufacturing place or a camp or something like that. So they do have memorandums of understanding. I believe that VR does provide some liability protections. Again, I think that Libby could speak more to that, but that is a consideration, and I'm glad the question was asked because it has to be discussed beforehand, because that's one of the biggest concerns employers have, is liability around hiring a person with a disability. So very good question.
So,
and go ahead.
This is Libby, and I just wanted to jump in to say that we do get that question quite often here in Maine. That is something people want to know. And when we're sending young people out on a work-based learning experience, typically we're paying their wages through a staffing agency, and the staffing agency or the community rehabilitation provider would ensure that that there's workers' comp and other coverages in place.
Great. And another question specific to Kentucky is, what are the types of jobs or the levels of jobs that youth are being placed in work-based learning experiences for? And I think that question is speaking more to, are these jobs that, lead to a minimum wage? Are they jobs that can really help maximize expectations and skill sets of youth with disabilities?
Yeah, I know, I'm thinking about the evaluation report I read a couple weeks ago, the draft for Kentucky. It is not a minimum wage stacking boxes job that they're looking at. They're looking for jobs in manufacturing that involve some use of mechanical equipment, that are providing some challenging opportunities that are above minimum wage. And I know they've had successes. I'm sorry, I can't think of the exact job types right now, but manufacturing and IT, there's a project called Code Louisville, where they're developing programming jobs and providing training to youth with disabilities, and I think in particular youth with autism. With the manufacturing jobs, they're really encouraging youth with visual impairments, both in Kentucky and Virginia. So these are not just minimum wage jobs, entry-level positions. They are entry-level positions, but they have career paths. So this is part of the whole conversation with these youth. It's not just about getting a job. It's about what career path do you want to be on. You said you really wanted to work in manufacturing. Now you've had that experience. Is it what you thought it was? And that's one of the findings. One of the things we're finding is that a lot of young people and their families think manufacturing is assembly line production, and they're learning from these camps and job shadowing that it's much, much more than that. There are a lot of different opportunities, and they are career paths. So that's been a big learning opportunity for the states.
Great. Excellent and very helpful. So I'm going to move us on to Maine, and then we can also circle back. We have a few other questions that came in, and I think some of them will be answered from Maine's perspective, but we'll make sure that we ask them. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Libby and Dr. Roberta Lucas.
Hi, everybody. Thank you so much for inviting us to join you today. Dr. Lucas and I work closely together, and I think one evidence of our partnership is the fact that I could call her up last week and say, would you like to do a webinar? And she was able to carve out some time to join me on the webinar. So we're very happy to be with you, and we're happy to.
Thank you for inviting me, Libby.
So before we, as we jump into our partnership, I just want to tell you a little bit about who we are. As you heard, I am the director for the Maine Division of Vocational Rehabilitation. And here in Maine, in the course of any given year, we serve people of all ages, but we start around age 14 and up, and about 40% of the individuals whom we serve are individuals of transition age, so that 14 to 24 population. We're working with young people to prepare them to enter employment, and we're really focusing on services that are going to help them around career exploration, work-based learning, guidance and counseling, education and training, leading to job development and placement. So our goal is always around employment and moving people towards employment. We are here in the Maine Department of Labor, so that's different in different states. Vocational rehabilitation may be in different offices. At the federal level, we're in education, and here at the state level in labor. We have a number of vocational rehabilitation counselors, and 25 of them are targeted VR counselors who work with the transition age population. So they're out in the schools, and they're working with special educators and youth and family on a daily basis. Every single Maine high school has a VR counselor who is assigned to work in that school, and that really helps to build relationships and to understand the communities in which they're working. Roberta?
So in Maine, we require that all 9th graders have post-secondary transition plans as part of their IEP. I know some states start with age 14, but in Maine we decided that 9th graders was a great place to start for that post-secondary transition planning, even though a lot of 8th grade graders have part of their transition planning already in place. We also provide professional development to all the high school staff every year that are up for compliance monitoring. So we last year were in about 35 high schools doing on-site professional development, talking about transition planning, talking about the activities and services that are local to the community in preparation for that post-secondary outcome, using the assessments that would help define the students' interest and where they would like to go. And we have partnered with other agencies across the state and in communities to prepare you for college and career readiness. We've partnered with the University of Maine. We've partnered with Maine Medical Center and Mass Medical University on a couple of pilots that we have started across the state.
Great. So just talking about how we got our partnership started, I myself came to vocational rehabilitation in 2010, and one of the things that we needed to do was update our memorandum of understanding between the Department of Education and vocational rehabilitation, and it was a great opportunity at that time to really look and see the population of young people we're serving, because we are serving very similar populations. And how is it that we can best align our resources and work together to share information? So we started with recognizing that shared population, working together on the Memorandum of Understanding. And then almost immediately there was an opportunity that the Department of Education had to go after some funding as a state personnel development grant. Roberta?
And so under our state personnel development grant, the SPDIG grant, Goal 5 was specific to transition planning. And we did a lot of work collaboratively with Voc Rehab and with other stakeholders across the state to develop a good plan on how to address the transition needs that students have in Maine.
And so as we were working together and spending a lot of time together, and in fact at one point somebody asked me if I had a desk over at the Department of Education because I was over there so much during that time, we also worked very closely with the National Technical Assistance Center on Transition, NTACT, or NSTAC as they were at that time.
And we continue, at the time of SPDIG and shortly into it, about I guess year 3 or 4, we met with NTAC and we became a technical assistance state under our SPPAPR. And so we also received a grant under NTAC to work on the transition compliance that was well below the national level that needed to be. And so we work really closely with NSTAC, which is now NTAC, and continue to be part of the work that NTAC does, and annually go to the Capacity Building Institute to continue that support from them and to get good collaborative ideas.
And I think the fact that we could identify that shared common goal, and as Roberta said, it was VR was at the table with education, but there were lots of community providers and family organizations who were also there, and that we could identify that shared goal and that we each had a piece of that goal, and how was it that working together we would be able to achieve that. So, of course, working together, we've been able to see a number of benefits of partnering. I think primarily has been the implementation of best practice. We've shared good resources across our system. We've been able to implement good practices that align in each of our programs. We've put a real focus on the student-centered, and we heard Dahlia talk about that earlier, the focus of keeping the student in the center of the process. And both of us, both Roberta and I, are at the state level, so we've really been able, through our networks, to be able to connect to local efforts on the ground where things are really happening. And I don't know if you want to speak to that.
Yeah, and just the connection to the ESSA, I'm part of one of the groups that's reviewing the comprehensive needs assessments at the local level. And the support that we can identify local communities and linkages for families and for resources for the comprehensive need assessment that each local district has, and thinking about transition from 8th to 9th grade, and also transition from beyond high school to college and career readiness. So that's also part of the work that I do and at the Department of Education as we look at the ESSA plans.
So we've really been lucky to kind of build that interagency dialogue, and we also work very closely with Department of Corrections, Department of Health and Human Services, and have that shared vocabulary and understanding, which we heard referenced earlier as well, so that we all know what we're talking about when we say a student with a disability, or when we talk about work-based learning, that there's a shared understanding of not just what do the words mean, but the importance to young people's transition planning. We've done a fair amount of cross-training. We certainly go to each other's meetings and participate in different events that are going on around the state. One of the places that we've really seen that come together nicely is through our efforts around joint policies. A few years ago, Maine was one of the first states to implement employment first, and that was really a joint effort between a number of state agencies, including the Department of Education and the Department of Labor. And there was a transition subcommittee recognizing the importance of getting young people prepared for employment as a first option. And I think at that time, the Maine Department of Education was co-chairing that transition committee. I was sitting on that committee as well. And we were really working to, you were there too, Roberta, and we were really working to try to both identify those recommendations that we would put forward and think about how we could carry them out. The Workforce Innovation and Opportunity Act that was passed in 2014 really changed the way we look at partnership as well, because it charged vocational rehabilitation with setting aside 15% of our total grant dollars that we received to focus on pre-employment transition services. So really the message to us was start with younger youth, work more collaboratively with the schools, and try to see if we can't do a better job aligning our services so that we're helping young people be prepared for employment. We're a very rural state. We have lots of school districts that are very, very small, and we don't want to be duplicating services. We really want to be working together to get that message out, and the WIOA law has really been a catalyst for doing that as well. Certainly data sharing, we mentioned that earlier, that can certainly be a challenge, but we're working together well in Maine right now as we speak, there's some data sharing agreements that are being signed that are going to help us to be able to share some data that we haven't been able to do in the past.
Which will help drive what we do. And as far as our state plan goes, we have with NTAC a state plan to increase our state agency work so that we can add more agencies to the transition planning. We used to have several transition plan groups across the state where agencies came together. Those have since been I don't know what you call it, but they're no longer in place. I don't know if they've been dismantled or not. But anyways, but we are working, Libby and I, one of our state plan goals was to become more collaborative in working together, especially around transition planning.
And I think just as we've said, really our goal is we have a shared population, we have shared goals, and let's see if we can use our resources in a way that gets them out to young people and really helps to prepare them for post-secondary education and employment. So just to talk a little bit about our stakeholders, certainly school districts, and how many school districts do we have around the state?
Well, it changes, Debbie. As of this year, I think we're about 256. Then they're very small to very large.
We also make sure that teachers, special education and general education teachers are very involved in the work that we're doing. Certainly we've talked about students and families and making sure that they're engaged in our process. And I think that's been a really nice piece of the work that we're doing, is that those groups are all at the table together with us, including our providers, our agencies in the community, special purpose private schools, and others who are working with us on these issues.
So like mentioned before, we have promoted a couple of pilots here in Maine. One is through the University of Massachusetts Medical School, and they've come in and they were working with 10 of our districts on 3 initiatives. One is on self-determination for students. One is working with the CTE or the technical education centers on certain work placement opportunities and certification, and one is with community engagement. So we have 10 schools districts that are working with tests of translating evidence for successful transitions, and they've come and done some training, and it's mostly for students who are identified with emotional disturbance, and working through the challenges and behaviors that they have in certain settings, and how to support them with different levels of stakeholders and engagement through education. We also partnered with Maine Medical Center doing work benefits navigator and post-secondary benefits planning. There was 2 schools districts that was working through that. One of them is our largest school district, and met with families and thinking about what are some of the benefit planning necessary for a child with a disability post high school. What does Social Security look like? What does insurance look like? And how does working help the student who may still need to be on Social Security receiving those benefits? We've also continue our partnership with National Technical Assistance Center. We meet with them biannually, working on our state plan. We work with them to get more resources, figure out best practices, and share those resources across the state as we gain them. And then we also go to the DCDT conference every year to also get more resources and network on other practices across different states that we might want to consider and incorporate here in Maine. And then we do have summer work experiences that is also through some of our low incident population. I'm on a grant for the Perkins grant, which works with the deaf blind, and they have some great summer work experiences for students with disabilities who are deaf blind identified. So we have many things going on in states that we try to partner with different grants and agencies to help support students with disabilities into the community and into post-secondary settings.
So, and I'm glad you mentioned summer work experience, Roberta, because that's a piece coming out of our work with Employment First. We really looked at the research that said it's so important for young people with disabilities to have a paid work experience before they exit high school. And I think here in Maine, we've really embraced that and tried to make sure between all of our different agencies and different programs that we're working with, that young people have that opportunity. We really want to raise aspirations. This summer alone, I think last summer we had about 200 young people working in summer placements through vocational rehabilitation. I saw some figures recently, about 225 are working right now. It's very exciting. I love it to see the young people's faces. Oftentimes people will send me pictures of them at work, or I get a chance to go out and actually see them on the job. And it's really one of the most rewarding pieces of the work, and knowing that we're helping to give people the skills, give young people the skills that they're going to need in order to go forward with their employment goals. So of course, we are always looking at data and using that data to help us with our decision making, and particularly looking at best practices as well. Roberta, do you want to talk a little bit here?
Sure. So when we had this big grant, we were looking at the data and how Indicator 13, which is the transition planning, data was just really not where we wanted it to be. So we looked at different ways to support the transition planning, and we started out collaboratively working at a regional level across the state to try to get some professional development out there. And what we discovered was that although it had an impact, it wasn't a great impact. And so we changed our practice of professional development going into the local schools that were up for audit. Like I said earlier, we were in about 30 schools last year, and it gave us a better opportunity to have one-to-one conversation or small group conversations with special educators and the challenges they talk about around transition planning. What are the activities and services that can be provided? What are the community connections? And how do they appropriately complete a transition plan that meets compliance but also has great opportunities for the student post-secondary? So we did move our compliance from in the low 50s and to mid-60s to now it's currently going to be 96% this year. So we've done a lot of work at the local level, and we found that having a face-to-face with local staff and administration has helped them think outside the box and to think in smaller groups, what can they do for a student with special needs and transition planning? And it's been very good. And it's also given us an opportunity to think about how can we get that post-secondary outcome data. I know that we've tried to get some of the data from both rehab and we have some of it internally, but we're having a hard time getting some of that post-secondary outcome data, and we're working on a different plan for that as well.
And so in VR, we certainly collect a lot of information about young people, and one of our goals certainly is to be able to work together closely with the Department of Education around planning and around looking at how what are the outcomes for these young people that we're working together on. And I think the data sharing, as we know, can be a challenge. But we have two levels. We can certainly talk at the aggregate level, and we can look at the group data. And for us in VR, we also have to do a state plan every few years, and we use a lot of Department of Education data to help us to actually determine how is it that we're going to use our resources, because we can see young people coming up. As an example is like many places here in Maine, we've seen increasing numbers of young people with autism. So we've been able to look at the Department of Education data, which is showing those numbers increasing over time from 3rd grade to 4th grade to 5th grade, and knowing that they're coming towards the age for VR services, and be able to plan and do some work to get our staff ready for those increased numbers and make sure that they have the resources they need in order to be able to serve them.
And one of the things that we do is we do a staff survey after our professional development to get their feedback on what more services they might need, or what other strategies and problem-solving issues they might have. So that data has really, quantitative data and qualitative data has really helped drive some of our instructional practices and resources that we give them. Do you want to talk about NTAC?
Well, I think you want to go ahead? Sorry.
Sure.
Yeah.
So again, we have continued to access NTAC as a National Technical Assistance Center for us for transition. They provide us with best practices and technical assistance. They've supported us through the SPDIG grant right up until this current year, and will continue moving on. They are a great research center, and they've given us a lot of information to use and tools. We use their checklist in a different format than what they provide, but a checklist to support the local districts as they think about their transition planning that they do with every student with a disability.
And they've really expanded their scope since the passage of WIOA, so they are doing much more around vocational rehabilitation, which has been great because it's supported both of our agencies and both types of work that we need to do. So we're happy to be working with them. And Dahlia mentioned to you earlier a transition work-based learning grant that we have going here in Maine, and we have lots of great partners who are working on that project with us, and including AIR and the Institute for Community Inclusion, Jobs for Maine Grads, and the CSAVR. So we're excited to see what that data is going to tell us as well. Looks like our slide might be stuck. There we go. Okay. So just as we wrap up, you know, one of the challenges certainly around doing partnership work is that you need to have the time, and we heard that alluded to, and we're both very busy, and in fact everybody across the state from the local level right on up, we all are very busy and working together. So it's really carving out that time and making sure that we make it a priority. Staffing is a challenge. We have turnover among our agency. There's been quite a sizable turnover among special education.
Yeah, we have about 200 special educators in Maine that don't meet quite the certification qualifications to be in the field. So we're providing special support for them through certification and mentoring. But it's very hard to find professional staff for schools in Maine right now.
So just making sure that we are able to continue the rapport between agencies and that trust that Dahlia spoke about, having consistent stakeholders certainly helps in that process. But when we look around, what are the things that help to support the partnership efforts? Certainly the professional development that you spoke about, Roberta, and doing joint professional development.
And even though we don't jointly go out and do it now, we have a binder that we give to every district, which has resources from the Department of Ed and resources from the Department of Labor through folk rehab, that gives every district just some more opportunity to think about what do they have available to them when they're doing transition planning.
And I think, as we also heard mentioned earlier, just keeping those lines of communication open, making sure that there's opportunities for building in regular communication, so that we're really in touch with what's happening. I know we have certainly Department of Education representatives who sit on committees here in Voc Rehab, and I have been sitting on the State Advisory Panel for Special Education. So we make sure that we have those opportunities to share information back and forth. And as I mentioned to you earlier, the Workforce Innovation and Opportunity Act has been a wonderful way to bring some of those partnerships to the forefront and really focus on how is it that we can serve this younger population and really help to do a good job to prepare them for post-secondary education and employment. So this is just a little graphic as we leave you around building skills. And the reality is that it does take many different efforts coming from different directions to be able to really move young people towards post-secondary success. And so it's what goes on in the classroom, it's what goes on at home and in the community, how we are working with some group activities that everyone can benefit from, and then the individualized transition and VR services and other support services that young people might need, really with the goal that we're giving them that strong foundation to be able to go out and be a success in whatever field they're interested in. And as we heard before, it's really important. We're preparing young people for the workforce of tomorrow. In Maine, we are an older state. We have an aging workforce, and we really need to have every young person be prepared to enter the workforce. We believe that everyone can work, and we're working with young people with that goal in mind. Yep. So we'll say thank you very much for having us here today.
We are so glad that you have been able to join us, and we do have some questions. So I'm going to start off with the first one, which is really a combination of two questions. You referenced the summer work experience and how you felt as a state that it's incredibly important that students be able to get a paid experience, work-based learning experience, before they graduate high school. So I've combined the question, but one of our participants in their state, they're actually having a problem, challenges around unpaid work-based learning experiences versus paid work-based learning experiences. So how are they able to move that process forward to get to the paid work-based learning experiences? What's been Maine's key strategies for making that happen, especially as you talked about some of those relationships with your employers across the state?
So that's a great question. Well, we believe really strongly that young people learn from the experience of being on the job, but also of getting a paycheck. So to connect that work means that I'm earning a paycheck, and many times these summer work experiences almost always are the first paid work that someone has done. There are many school programs around the state that do different types of work-based learning during the school year, and those may be paid or unpaid. But our focus really around the summer has been to partner with school districts and to use some of our resources and leverage other resources in the community. So it may be that VR is able to help pay the wages, let's say, for somebody to work, but the school is able to provide the transportation. I mean, we have some school districts where they've lined up their summer work experience program to fit with extended school year services, so there's already a bus that's running out into the community, and these young people who are participating in the work can join in the bus and be able to be transported. Some school districts have said, we think this is so important, we're going to dedicate a staff person to work with you on this. So we really try to look at the resources that each school district brings and to put together a program that that meets their needs and leverages the resources, including VR's ability to pay for wages or to pay for some other supports that young people might need. We're one of the programs that goes on during the school year that's very successful here in Maine is the Jobs for Maine's Grads program, and they're really helping young people across the state become prepared for employment. And we're working, I think we have 3 different contracts with them now, and I know the Department of Education is also doing a number of different efforts so that we're really able to leverage the resources. So if they're working with young people and helping them prepare for employment, then we come in and are able to use our resources as a jumping off point from there. So rather than do duplicative efforts, we're really trying to line things up that allows us to have the funding available to pay those wages for youth. Now, having said that, there are many employers who don't, who are very happy to take on the young people and don't need the wage support, and are able to pay them directly. And some of the things that VR might do are maybe some things behind the scenes, or we might help pay for job coaching, or in that case we might help pay for some support around transportation. So again, it's looking at what we can bring to the table, and employers have been so open to this. They really are excited to have young people, and we are doing individualized placement. So we're trying to put young people in placements where they have an interest. There's something about that job that appeals to them. They're excited to learn more about the job, and they're working side by side with other young people without disabilities, which is so key. So they're having an experience that most of us, many of us certainly had in terms of the summer job.
Oh, that's excellent. And just a quick question directly connected to how some employers don't need wages. So one of the things you referenced was how rural of a state Maine is. You have a lot of rural pockets. Do you find that there are challenges with having employers even existing in certain areas to allow for this collaboration or the alignment across your 2 systems? And if so, what have you found that's worked to address that? Yeah,
so certainly that can be a challenge. I mean, we refer to them as kind of the mom and pop employers, so the small employers. But one of the things that we've really seen is that the small employers, because they are community-based, are really invested in the young people. And as you're saying, Roberta, very open to supporting young people in the community. So some of the concerns that we might have really are non-existent when we get out there into the field. Now, there are certainly some challenges around the types of jobs that are available. Certainly in some very small communities, there are limited types of jobs. But in terms of employers being open and willing, we've absolutely found that they are.
Great. And we have another question that relates to one of you mentioned university partnerships, and I think this is also a 2-part question, and they were hoping you could expand on that a little bit more. So for example, is the partnership to increase opportunities for youth with disabilities, or is there also work being done in professional development the same way that you reference is happening within K through 12 and VR, around improving pre-service to teachers, leaders, VR counselors, et cetera? So in other words, is part of that connection also to help prepare the universities to continue the work that you all have already implemented in the K through 12 space?
So part of our partnership with the UMass University Medical School was based on a grant and the preparation for students to go into the workforce. They were all through our state was chosen to be the one to look at the career and technical education centers in Maine and how to engage students into attending to the program as opposed to they have at-risk students with high absenteeism. So part of that work was to support students in getting into the programming and being successful in the programming and getting the certification to be employment ready. So that was a partnership that we did with the University of Massachusetts Medical Center. We do have some partnerships with the University of Maine, but it is around planning for staff to be prepared to work with students with disabilities and doing transition planning. So it's both sides of the work with the university system. I think that answers your question.
So I'll just make one quick plug. Our sister agency, Division for the Blind and Visually Impaired, runs a number of exciting summer programs, and one of them is in partnership with the University of Maine system, where students who are blind or visually impaired come to campus for a 5-week period, and
That's right.
really around preparing them to enter post-secondary education. It's very targeted, and our hope is actually to be expanding that, working collaboratively with the university and with Division for the Blind next year to be able to expand that a little bit more broadly for our population. But we are also always looking at how to leverage the resources, certainly, of the university.
And engage more stakeholders as they become, we become more aware of them.
Great. Excellent. Well, I'm just scrolling to see if we've got any unanswered questions in the box. And if we do, we will definitely forward them to both Libby Stone-Sterling and Dr. Roberta Lucas. We want to thank you so much for presenting today on today's webinar and sharing your strategies, sharing your challenges. And this is the exact type of partnership that we think about when we think about aligning systems and cross-stakeholder partnerships to support youth with disabilities in their both college and career readiness. And I think it's a great example for people to draw from. We'll make sure that your website is up, and references to some of the initiatives that you mentioned are also highlighted for participants. So as we near our wrap up, I just really want to thank you both for sharing the excellent work that you all are doing in your state.
Thank you.
Thank you very much for having us. It was a pleasure to do it.
Great. And so as we close out, we just want to share a resource that we feel participants might find helpful. One of them is our CCRS Center Asked a Team Brief on how ESSA and IDEA can support college and career readiness for students with disabilities. And specifically, this brief will examines data on secondary and post-secondary education and employment outcomes and of students with disabilities. And also it considers how college and career readiness strategies can support students with disabilities. And then it provides an analysis of the provisions under ESSA and IDEA that support college and career readiness, including some examples of effective practices and some guidance for state leaders. In addition, on the next slide, we also have additional resources that participants might find useful. And all of these, along with today's slide deck and bios of today's presenters, will be posted on the CCRS Center website. So I just want to thank everybody for joining us today, and I strongly encourage you to join us for the 4th of our series in the pursuit of equity in supporting students with disabilities in career readiness. And the date for that should be confirmed within the next 2 weeks, but we would love to have you all participate in that webinar as well. So thank you very much for joining us today, and thank you once again to all of our presenters.
Thank you.